Good morning, it's Sunday here in Scotland and welcome to Dark Side of the Mic. Today I thought we'd do a follow-up recording on the KAM RT-1 capsule. Now you may remember I did a very brief introductory recording to the sound just a couple of weeks ago, and it's a fairly dark sounding capsule, so I thought it'd be quite useful to compare it to a series of other what I would consider fairly dark dynamic mics, and we'll get a sense of how it sounds in comparison to those. Now, as I explained previously, the RT in the capsule stands for ribbon tone, and the idea is that it accentuates the warmth in the low end and the articulation in the high end. So it's a fairly V-shaped sort of sound, and there's certainly a very definite proximity effect. If I was to go right up on the capsule at the moment, you get a real sense of how it sounds when you're right on it. To me, this sounds a little bit tubby at this point, and I would tend to recommend everyone backs off a little bit. But this is how it would sound when you're right on it, and you do really get an overwhelming sense of low end when you're this close to the microphone. But if we were to back off a little bit, just a couple of inches, I think it really evens itself out a little bit more and is much nicer, much smoother, and much more balanced to my ears. And before we get into the dynamic comparisons, I thought I'd do a quick few seconds on the SE Electronics X1R. Now this is the only ribbon microphone I have here, but I thought it would be useful to do a kind of baseline recording with a ribbon sound. I think this is a wonderfully smooth but very dark mic. Very smooth in the low end, a lot of warmth there, but it does have a bit of an extension in the high end as well. So it's doing similar things to what the KAM is doing, but overall I think it's much smoother and warmer altogether. So I don't think anything can really replicate a true ribbon sound. And now we've moved over onto the Shure SM7B. Now whenever you think of a dark dynamic mic, this is the gold standard, if you like. It's the gold standard in dynamic mics generally. So it has a very smooth, rich sound. What the SM7B does incredibly well is a really flat mid-range. So what that does, it tends to make your voice sound really very natural and balanced, although being very warm. It's a very familiar sound that everybody knows and everybody loves. But it also rolls off the high end considerably, and there's a reason for that. It nullifies any sibilance or mouth clicks that would happen with close talk microphones such as this. So it's ideal for things like radio broadcasting and podcasting because of that design. And at this point we've moved over onto the Behringer XM8500. Now while this would probably be considered as the polar opposite to something like the SM7B, it's nowhere near as rich, smooth or natural sounding, it does do a few things fairly well when you compare it to mics in the sub $100 category. A lot of those mics are very thin sounding and quite brittle sounding overall. They have no low end, but the Behringer does have a low end. It's maybe a little bit muddy, but it is a much darker sound overall, which I tend to enjoy and prefer, especially for spoken word applications. It's clearly not the smoothest mic overall. It does have a few stabbing peaks in the high end, but the presence of that low end kind of proximity effect does help to kind of disguise that and balance it out. So I think it's a pretty good option, especially if you're on a budget. And now we've moved over onto the Rode Procaster, which is a $250 broadcast style dynamic mic, and it certainly is much brighter than say something like the SM7B. It is however still a very smooth sound. The frequency response for this mic is a very smooth curve with a sort of mid-forward delicate presence boost that just adds a little bit more air to your voice. I've used this mic quite a lot on podcast hosts and guests because I think it works fairly well practically on any voice you stick in front of it. It's very flexible like that. You can't always say that with something like the SM7B, which can often sometimes be just too dark for some voices. And now we've moved over onto the SE Electronics V7X, and out of the two models that SE Electronics do, I think the V7s are both fantastic microphones, but the V7X model offers slightly more low end and slightly more darkness overall. It's a super cardioid mic, so it's not as open as airy as say what the Procaster is, but it does feel a lot less sizzly than the Procaster. certainly much smoother in that high end, which I really enjoy. I think the articulation of this mic is really quite fantastic, and the overall sound is, for £75, is incredible for what you get. And now we've moved over onto what is possibly my favourite dynamic mic of the moment. This is the Beyerdynamic M201 TG, which is a hypercardioid instrument dynamic mic, so you have to use a pop filter with this. Now this is a £160 microphone, but the sound signature to me is very similar to the SM7B, with the exception being that the M201 TG has a bit more of a higher end extension. Because of that, I think it sounds very articulate, almost condenser-like in its sound, which is incredibly unusual for a dynamic mic. I think this is wonderful for spoken word applications. It's used a lot on the BBC and really is possibly the best dynamic mic I think you can buy at the moment. And now we've moved back over onto the KAM RT-1 capsule for some final thoughts. I think this capsule, considering it's only $20, offers a fairly smooth, warm sound. The high end is really quite articulate without sounding overly harsh. But it's not a natural sound. This is a fairly coloured microphone. And at times it borders on being quite nasally and tubby is the word I keep coming back to. Kind of like the fat kid who's eaten all the ice cream and then tries to talk with his mouth full. There's a hollowness there that doesn't really sound that natural on my voice. The low end feels quite narrow and it's very noticeable. It's not the broad bass extension you would typically expect with proximity on a microphone. From today's comparisons, I thought the V7X sounded absolutely incredible for a $100 or £75 mic. And if you jump back and forward between that, the SM7B and the M201 TG, I really think it's in that kind of ballpark. It's such a warm, articulate and smooth sound. Incredible for the money. Okay, so that about wraps it up for this week. Let me know what you think about the comparisons. What was your favourite? Until next time, take care.